Okay, we've come to our last talk of the convention. This is going to be a really interesting one. We've got a talk from Dr. Judy Melinek and TJ Mitchell. So Judy has broad experience in forensic psychology, working in San Francisco for nearly 20 years. TJ earned a degree in English Lit from Harvard. Together, they've published the New York Times bestseller, Working Stiff, 2 years, 262 bodies, and the making of a medical examiner. The book is a memoir that chronicles Judy's experience as a New York City medical examiner during and after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The successful Kiwi response to COVID-19 brought them to our shores last year, with Dr. Melinek now working in Wellington performing autopsies. This should be a very interesting story. So welcome, you guys, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Craig. I have to correct one thing that you just said, though. Judy is not a forensic psychologist. She's a forensic pathologist. She actually has a cousin who's a forensic psychologist.
Yes, sorry, my bad. My bad.
Okay. You can hear us okay?
Yes, all good.
All right, so let's proceed. We might as well get started with our talk. I'm just going to see how this forwards. Can we control? Okay, so I'm going to be talking, go back one more. There we go. So we're going to be talking about death investigation in general, just give people an overview. I'll talk about the difference between the United States and New Zealand. I'll talk a little bit about scene investigation and give everybody kind of forensic pathology overview, kind of forensic pathology 101 if you're interested in the field, talking about autopsy and time of death, a little overview about blunt trauma, sharp trauma, and gunshot wounds and how that's integrated into testimony. And then we'll talk a little bit about our forensic writing, both fact and fiction, since we were talking, it's kind of a theme of this conference to some degree is both fact and fiction.
We are a married couple, by the way. I am a writer and I'm here today mostly to do color commentary.
But you know your science too. So coronial services in New Zealand is through the Ministry of Justice. Here I have a picture of the website, and that's where you can access, if somebody dies, that's where the information is with regards to coronial services. And the coroner system is through the Ministry of Justice. The National Initial Investigation Office, or NIO, is called when someone dies at home or if the death is violent or unexpected. And NIO coordinates the initial death investigation between the police and assigns the case to the coroner. And police have investigators who talk to the family. And the mortuaries, where I work is at Wellington, we have doctors who do an autopsy to find out why the person died.
The word coroner is used in the United States for death investigation systems also. It's a very different type of coroner, and Judy will get into that. The other term that they use in the United States is medical examiner. All of those coroners and medical examiners in the United States are forensic pathologists like Judy, but the coroners here in New Zealand are not, right?
The coroners here are solicitors, they're lawyers. So a coroner is an independent judicial officer appointed by the Governor General. They must be a barrister and solicitor, and some have medical or health backgrounds. There's 17 full-time coroners plus the chief. It's a 24-hour system, but they do not go to the scene. So I've never seen a coroner at the scene. The police will go. Sometimes I get called to a death scene, but the coroners are not there. They're primarily doing an administrative function. And in the last year that we have complete data, 2018 to 2019, there were 3,792 deaths that were investigated by the coronial system in New Zealand. They're inquisitorial, not adversarial. So we were not having, lawyers representing sides or anything like that. They're just doing an inquiry to figure out what happened. And they're split up into 4 different regions in New Zealand. So if we go to the next slide, we have a handy dandy map. So you can see that Auckland is the bright green region at the time. You at the top of the North Island, you've got Palmerston North. I'm in Wellington, which is at the bottom of the North Island, and then the entire South Island. The only forensic mortuary there is in Christchurch. So reportable deaths are defined by the Coroners Act of 2006. These are deaths where not enough is known about the cause of the illness leading to the death. So there's no doctor who can reasonably issue a medical certificate of death. Any death that's due to trauma, suicide, unnatural or violent means, or subsequent complications, for example, falls, anaphylaxis, and drug reactions. And now with the fact that we've been vaccinating a lot of people for COVID, any potential deaths that are, if there's a question that it's as a result of the jab, then those also get reported to the coronial system and get investigated. So that falls under the final category, which deaths is during or after a medical, surgical, or dental operation, treatment, procedure, including recovery of consciousness from anesthesia or as a result of administration of anesthetic or medication, and that includes vaccination as well.
So the deaths that you do autopsies on are not all murders like you see on television.
Yeah, so this is again where fact and fiction sometimes collide. On television, it seems like every death a forensic pathologist investigates is a suspicious death. In real life, those are about 10% of our cases. So in a given year, I might do about 250 cases, maybe 20 at the most will be homicides. In Wellington, it's actually less than that. And then the remainder are going to be some combination of natural, accident, and suicide.
So reportable here does not mean suspicious.
Correct. And so now I'm going to give you just a little overview of the definition of cause of death, because this has been an issue not just in the realm of COVID, but in general, people don't understand what cause of death means. So I like to go line by line here because it's really important to try to understand this. They tend to be confused by the press and also in even in medical publications. A lot of doctors don't know what cause of death is. So let's just go, what does cause of death mean? Well, what cause of death means is it's either a disease or an injury that is etiologically specific. So etiologically specific means it's not due to something else. And the example I like to use for this is, the medical term is myocardial infarct or heart attack. Heart attack is the non-medical term. Myocardial infarct is the medical term. Everybody thinks, oh, he died from a heart attack. He died from myocardial infarct. And the question I like to ask is that really enough of a cause of death? Can myocardial infarct stand on its own? Is it etiologically specific? Meaning, is it due to just one thing, or can it be due to multiple different things? So the examples I like to give is you can have a heart attack, a myocardial infarct, due to hardening of the arteries from cholesterol. That's atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease.
And perhaps the biggest killer in New Zealand, certainly in the United States.
In the United States as well as here.
Yeah.
And so you can have a heart attack from that, but you can also have a heart attack from snorting too much cocaine.
Yeah.
And so you can also have a heart attack because you have a collagen vascular disorder, a genetic illness that damages your coronary arteries, and those cause you to have a heart attack.
Or you can have a heart attack because you double-crossed someone and he shot you and you bled until your heart could no longer work. Right?
Correct. So you had enough blood loss that you died. And so and now you can see from the examples I gave that myocardial infarct or heart attack is not etiologically specific because it can be due to multiple different things. And the different things it's due to are really the cause of death. So in the examples we gave, atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, which is the narrowing of the arteries from cholesterol, that's one cause of death. The other is acute cocaine intoxication, that's another cause of death. And then the third one, the last one that you gave, is exsanguination secondary to gunshot wound. That's a third cause of death.
And each of those is a different manner of death, which Judy's going to get into in a minute.
Yeah.
The difference between cause and manner is very important. But in those three cases, the first one is natural manner, the second one is an accident, and the third one is homicide.
Right. So it's got to be the disease or injury, and so back to our definition here, which starts the lethal sequence of events. So what started the process? It's not the heart attack. It's the thing that started it, okay? What started the lethal sequence of events without sufficient intervening causes? So the intervening cause, I'll give you kind of an example. The one I like to give is if a person is on a diving board at a party, okay, and they jump off the diving board into the pool and they break their neck, and people realize that they're not coming up, they pull them out, the person does not drown, but he's now got spinal cord injury and he's paralyzed from the basically the neck down, and for many years he suffers from complications of quadriplegia. So 20 years pass, and 20 years later he finally dies of complications of quadriplegia. respiratory failure, bed sores, which you can get, pressure sores from not being able to move your limbs, urinary tract infections. All those complications can lead to your death prematurely because of that injury that you had when you were in your 20s. So what started the lethal sequence of events was the injury at the pool party. I don't care that 20 years have passed until you finally died. That is what started the lethal sequence.
Let's say you die of pneumonia. The pneumonia
Yeah.
is not the cause of death, right?
Correct. It's pneumonia due to complications of quadriplegia. Remember, that's the difference, because pneumonia can be due to multiple different things. It's not etiologically specific. But what started the lethal sequence for our quadriplegic was that injury to the neck. He would not have died when he did at the age of 40, for instance, had he not been injured when he was in his 20s. And examples from popular culture that I can mention would be, for example, Ronald Reagan. His press secretary was shot
in 1982 during an assassination attempt against Reagan. Yes, and
he was disabled and ended up dying many years later of complications of that gunshot wound.
Brady,
so that's yes, James Brady, and that's what started the lethal sequence of events. Now, if you're quadriplegic, in our hypothetical example, went into the bank to take out money because they were, functional otherwise, or were going on a walk with their caregiver in a wheelchair, and then someone came by and shot them, then that would be a sufficient intervening cause. So a lot of times my job is to try to figure out what the cause of death is. And in order to do that, I have to do an autopsy. So we're going to get to that in a second. But before we get to cause of death, I do want to say that causes are also categorized, as TJ said earlier, by different types of manners. So if the death is due to disease or aging, it's called a natural death. If it's due to some sort of unforeseeable act or hostile environment. So the examples I see the most often are people who overdose on drugs. Those are often accidents. Motor vehicle collisions where people get injured or hit. Those would be accidents. Trips and falls are accidents.
Drug overdoses are the most common accident.
Most common accident that I see.
Right. Fatal accidents.
And then homicide is death at the hand of another. So that's due to the physical actions of another person. And then we also have the manner of death of suicide, when the person has an intentionally self-destructive act where they're trying to kill themselves. And for that, we look for a preponderance of the evidence. We look for evidence at the scene, for example, a suicide note or social media postings or something to indicate that they intended to kill themselves. And then we're also allowed to use pending, which means we're waiting for our lab results.
Pending doesn't mean we don't know.
Yeah,
it means we're waiting.
Exactly. And the press also gets this one wrong, because what they tend to do is they say, oh, and usually a celebrity dies, and then the next day they'll have in the press, an autopsy was performed, but it was inconclusive. It was inconclusive. Yes, they'll say it's the coroner or the medical examiner could not determine the cause of death. That is not undetermined, which is our final option. It's actually pending. If you're getting the results the next day and they don't know what it is, that means because we're waiting for laboratory tests, and in many cases that means that we're concerned about things like an overdose, so we need the toxicology to come back, and that can take several weeks.
Or even things called like histology, which means you're looking at microscopic slides of what's going on in the body that you may not be able to see with the naked eye in the gross manner of the autopsy.
That's right. So there are a lot of cases that might be pending, and then a month later or a few months later, we'll get the result of the cause of death. And the most recent one was Gabby Petito in the United States, who her remains were found, and there was some level of decomposition. And initially, the coroner said we don't have an answer right now.
They said the manner was homicide.
They said the manner was homicide, but they said the cause was pending.
Right.
And then about a month later, they finally came out and said it was strangulation. So that was a delay brought on by they needed to do additional testing.
Right.
So undetermined means that the death does not classify easily, that it might fall into one or two categories, or the remains are so badly decomposed or damaged that I can't figure out how to classify it. So I work currently in Wellington Hospital. This is me in the mortuary, and that's the emergency room where we work behind. And that's where I am at my microscope. So just to kind of give you an overview about what that kind of looks like on a day-to-day basis.
There are no emergency autopsies.
Yes, there are, but we are actually physically located behind the emergency room. So when I do an autopsy, I should warn you, I don't have any graphic or disturbing pictures, but there are some photos that give you an idea about what I do. So for example, this is me performing an autopsy wearing my typical personal protective equipment. And in my hand, you can see some lopping shears.
Yes.
That I think this photo was taken back in the States.
Mm-hmm.
We got that at Orchard Supply Hardware, which is a hardware store, and those can be used for cutting ribs. And then you can see in the right-hand corner, there's a ladle and a scalpel. Those are typical tools that I use. The ladle is used for removing blood from body cavities.
The autopsy is not a sterile field.
No.
So doctors who perform autopsy, even though it is a form of surgery,
Right.
Often use tools that you will find in your kitchen or your local hardware store,
Right.
just because they get the job done.
And the PPE, the personal protective equipment, is primarily to protect me. I'm not going to be contaminating the dead body, unlike in a surgery where we wear personal protective equipment also so that we don't end up contaminating the sterile field. So a typical autopsy, first I go on the outside of the body, I go external examination. I start with the head, describe the color of the hair, the color of the eyes, piercings, tattoos, anything that I see, and then work my way down, describing any marks or identifying scars, any signs of disease or injury on the outside of the body. Does the skin look a little yellow? Are there hemorrhages underneath the fingernails? Any clue that I might have to from the outside of the body to what is going on inside. And then we make a Y incision, which I've got in my schematic diagram here, from shoulder to shoulder and down to the groin. And we peel back the layers and remove the organs one by one. And we weigh them. And the reason we weigh them is because we have standard weights that we can compare to known published cases, and so that we know if the organ is too big. So that's an example of liver being weighed in a scale, and it's kind of like a butcher scale in terms of what we use.
It's exactly like a butcher scale.
Yeah.
It's a butcher scale.
That one's from the Alameda County office. So what we do is we know what a normal heart should weigh for this person's age or body size, and then if the heart is too big, then that's usually a signal to us that there's something abnormal about it. And then we document with every single organ if there's any signs of disease or injury. And we document things in diagrams, in photographs, and also in our autopsy report.
The organs all go back in the body afterwards, but they all go into the body cavity just in a plastic bag, including the brain, just go back into the body cavity and get sewn up.
Yeah, and then because of the way we do the autopsy through limited incisions, bodies that have had autopsies can still have open caskets. So they're, in many cases, unless they've had devastating trauma or decomposition, they can still be viewable. And the family can still pay their final respects.
We won't get into it, but they open the scalp and the skull in such a way that it can be put back together, and you can still have a view.
And our technicians in the mortuary are incredibly careful about closing things up and making things look aesthetically pleasing, so that the funeral homes don't have as much work to do. We really try to be respectful of the remains, especially with regards to cultural sensitivities. There are many cultures that, the idea of doing an autopsy is abhorrent to them or offensive. And so we need to be able to work with those families to try to come to an accommodation to get the cause of death without offending those cultural sensitivities. So how do we determine the cause of death? Well, the majority of cases are pretty easy. If I have overwhelming trauma, like multiple gunshot wounds, homicide, that's pretty easy. I can figure out the cause of death. The cases that are hard are the ones where there's a compelling story, but there's not enough trauma on the body to account for the death. Like there's a disconnect between the story and the body, or there's lots of trauma on the body and the story doesn't explain it all. So anytime I get a disconnect, and this is true of science in general, is anytime you get a disconnect between the data that you're collecting, the physical evidence you're collecting, and the information you're being given, that means you have to do more work. And that means sometimes you have to talk to families or review medical records or do additional testing so you can get to a conclusion. So when I have those questions, then I reach out to my scene investigators, and the scene investigators are the ones who, we lost our slides for a second there. They're the ones who talk to the family or talk to the person who found the deceased. And they will be the ones who ask questions about what particularly happened. When were they last seen alive? Was the room locked or secure? What was the position of the body when it was found before it was moved? moved. And they will get that information and put it in the report that I get before I even start my autopsy. They will also snoop around. They will look for clues to corroborate the stories that they're being given. They'll look in other rooms. They'll look behind the door, in the closet, in the rubbish, the bedside table. And they're there to try to get evidence to try to figure out why the person died. So that's where they can collect evidence. In the United States, you don't need a warrant for a death scene investigation.
It's very useful if you're a crime writer,
So,
because the books, the novels that we write together have a forensic pathologist as the detective. So they're not police procedurals. In a police procedural, you would need your detective to get a warrant. We don't need to get a warrant.
You don't need to if it's a death investigation. It's a different type of investigation.
Yeah.
And the next thing is it's a little different from a regular death scene investigation versus a homicide. So in a homicide scene, that's when the police will set up a perimeter. They will call the crime scene unit and they will call the homicide detectives. And they'll call either the coroner or ME in the United States, or here sometimes I get called out to the scene. And I've done that here in New Zealand as well. And the crime scene unit will photograph and document what they see.
Crime scene unit in the United States is part of the police department. Usually,
yes.
right?
And even here, they will come out and they'll sketch or they'll draw up evidence. And we have contractors who work with forensic biology, and they will collect DNA evidence and things like that at the scene, or look for blood spatter. And they will describe the environment, the flora, the fauna, the odors, the lights, the temperature, any insects on the body. But it's my job to be responsible for the body and observe what's on the body. So if, in general, the rules are that they don't want to take anything from the body. It should stay on the body. If it's a homicide, and it should come with the body all in the bag. So there are sometimes when you watch television shows, you'll see police officers taking things off the body. They're not supposed to do that.
You'll also see the forensic pathologist taking one look at a bug and saying, this body's been here for 18 hours.
Right.
Judy is not a forensic entomologist.
Right.
She knows some things about bugs,
right.
but that is another subspecialty.
Yeah, what I know about bugs is that I know I'm supposed to collect them in a jar and give them to a forensic entomologist. So television shows tend to take all these different realms of forensic expertise and put them all together in one person. And in reality, there are usually multiple different people who do those jobs. But I think that would just be confusing for a plot.
Although when you were in San Francisco, you did carry a badge, which was cool.
Yes, I did have a badge. So what we often get asked about, the most common forensic questions that we get asked, both from coroners as well as from the lay public, is the first one is about time of death. People want to know exactly when a person died. And the reality is that the science is not that accurate. The scene investigation is often the most reliable indicator. When was the last time the person was seen alive, and when were they found dead? And then look for things like maybe their mail is piling up. When was the last time they brought it in? The phone messages, when they usually, they text people regularly and all of a sudden they stopped. Those tend to be the most reliable to narrowing down that time interval, because the other things, the scientific things like rigor mortis, which is the stiffening of the body, livor mortis, which is the pooling of blood after death, and algor mortis, which is the cooling of the body, they're all got plus or minus multiple hours. And they're also highly dependent on the ambient temperature. So if you die in a hot environment and it just happens to be hotter than your body, you're not going to cool off. And rigidity will happen a lot faster, and lividity will pool a lot faster. And as opposed to if you die in a cool environment, your body will be preserved for a lot longer. So they're not that reliable. And I know that on televisions, they get it down to the 15-minute or half hour. That is not correct. We can also use stomach emptying. It takes about 4 hours for the stomach to empty on average, but it depends again on how much food you had, if you had alcohol with that food, if you're diabetic, it might be slowed down. So there are different anatomic or conditions that can affect that. And then there's also, you could take the potassium level in one eye versus the other and graph that out. But again, it's highly dependent on the ambient temperature.
And we have fun in our novels, again, playing with the real way that time of death gets determined and what it can and cannot tell you.
So you have to be careful about how accurate that is, because it's you can give kind of ballparks, but it's not that reliable. And then there's also postmortem changes. So as the body passes the time that the membranes of the cells are now starting to fall apart, the body's own enzymes will digest the cells. That's called autolysis, auto being self, lysis being digestion, so self-degradation. And putrefaction has to do with the bacteria. We have a microbiome where we have bacteria that live in our gut and live in our mouth, and fungi that are on the surface of our skin, and they want to, now they can actually,
when you're dead, they can
us.
go hog wild
Right.
on you. Yes.
Then your immune system's no longer protecting you. Your skin integrity starts to break down. So they enter into your bloodstream, and they start to break things down and create things like alcohol. So, and a decomposed body, alcohol might be caused by bacteria. It may not be from drinking alcohol. And then if you've got pets, you're going to look at them a little differently. Cats and dogs, if they get hungry enough and you've been around for a while, they will eat you after
Your
you
cat
die.
won't wait till you're cold.
Yeah. Cats will go faster than dogs. It depends on the dog. The yappy dogs will eat you fast, but the golden retrievers will sit by your body at least a little longer, at least until they get really hungry. And adipocere is a change that you sometimes see. It's also called grave wax. It's a waxy change in bodies that are in a cool and dry environment.
Adipocere is really cool. If you want to
really
Google that, it's really interesting.
If you want to, well, I mean, remember, warning, they're graphic photos if you look it up. But so, the first thing that I'm asked about when it comes to injuries are the different types of injuries. And so you need to know that there's different terminology that we use. We use the term abrasions, contusions, and lacerations when it comes to blunt trauma. So if injury is caused by a broad plane or an uneven surface, those can cause scrapes or abrasions, bruises or contusions, and tears of the skin, which are also known as lacerations. And we describe them based on the location on the body, their size and color. And then we have to ask ourselves, does the story fit the observed injury? So here is a rugby player who has been injured. You could see that there is an abrasion on the eyebrow and a bit of a laceration coming out over the eye. And then there's also a contusion and an abrasion on the cheek. And that's consistent with the fact that he was actually kicked in the face
and that's
by
what the
another
story
player.
is.
And that was the story. It was
right.
actually observed by one of my colleagues who is,
does the injury match the story?
Yeah. So what we do is we look for the injury, and then we have to see if it matches the story or what the eyewitnesses saw. And we want to distinguish blunt trauma.
Geometry lesson.
Yeah. So the blunt trauma can be used in some cases to help us figure out whether an injury was due to, for example, an accidental fall as opposed to a beating. And one of the things that we can do is we can count the planes of injury. So this is the participatory part of the lecture. We might as well make it fun since it's the last one. Take your hand, make a plane, put it on your face like this. And you'll feel how it touches your eyebrow, your nose, and your cheek. So if you fell down and hit the ground, you can have up to 3 separate injuries that are all caused by a single plane of injury. But if you have injury on the other side of your face, that's from a separate plane. So that has to be a separate impact. And it's not going to be from a simple fall. It's going to be either from a complex fall or because someone punched you. And then especially on the back of the head, as you can see, any additional plane of injury indicates that a person was impacted multiple times. So if I have a person who's dead on the sidewalk and they have multiple planes of injury and there's no place for them to have tumbled down, then I can reasonably conclude that they were probably beaten before they fell. Okay. And that's important in terms of trying to figure out or help the police investigate what happened to this individual. And so to distinguish blunt trauma from sharp trauma, I have this diagrammatic slide that shows you the blunt trauma on the right with the hammer, where you have tissue bridging, which is the little strings of tissue that hold together, abraded edges, which is the uneven edges caused by a blunt surface, and undermining, which is flaps of skin that are underneath the skin. And that's what happens when you hit somebody with a blunt object. But if you cut someone with a knife, knives are sharp. You don't get the tissue bridging, the undermining, and the abraded edges. Instead, you have a very, very smooth, clean margin. That might be a bloody wound, but the margins of the wound will be very, very clean. And so the terminology we use for sharp trauma is different. It's not abrasion, contusion, and laceration the way we used in blunt. Instead, we use the term incised wound for a wound that's wider than it is deep. We use the term stab wound for a wound that's deeper than it is wide. And the term chop wound is used for when you use something like a hatchet or machete or an axe. Those are unwieldy weapons, and they look sharp on the outside because they have sharp edges, but they look blunt on the inside because of their heft and weight. And those tend to be homicides or sometimes postmortem dismemberment. So one of the things that we use
She's fun at parties.
One of the things we use as terms is that of defensive injuries. And there are courts where we're not allowed to use this terminology. So instead, I just say injuries on surfaces of the upper arms that are consistent with a person putting up their arm as if they were protecting their face, which is basically the same thing. So you can have them on the palms of the hands, on the forearms, on the upper arms, as well as a person is trying to defend themselves. And it indicates usually that there's been some sort of struggle and that the victim saw it coming, so to speak. And so the other terminology that I need to become familiar with and I need to be able to communicate to juries is that of gunshot wounds. Gunshot wounds have certain characteristics. The entrance wounds tend to be round punched out holes with rims of abrasions. The exit wounds tend to be lacerated, but it's not 100%. You can have atypical entrances. For example, if a bullet ricochets off of something before it comes in, and they can look just like exits. You can also have atypical exit, where an exit comes out of the body but gets stuck in, for example, the back of a chair or the wall. That's called a shored exit wound, and it looks just like an entrance. So it really helps to have scene information, police information, eyewitness information to help to try to reconcile some of the information that we're getting from the autopsy with the final component, which is what we have to present to a jury, usually in a legal case when it's presented when the person goes to trial. So I believe the next slide is
it's very important that if there's been a gunshot wound in a body, you have to dig the bullet out or account for where it is, right?
That is, yeah. So I look for the entrance and I look for either where the exit is or where the bullet is on the x-ray, and then I follow the track through the body. And
which is almost always a straight line, by the way. The idea of magic bullets bouncing around in bodies does not happen. The bullet goes in pretty much a straight line. It might hit a stout piece of bone and go caroming off at a slightly different angle, but it won't ricochet around.
Yeah, so it can ricochet with one point, but there's no scrambling inside.
And you have to retrieve that bullet with your bare fingers. Well, I mean, your gloved fingers, not with a tool. Right?
Correct, yeah. You don't want to use metal forceps or anything that will scratch them or alter the evidence. So I believe the next slide, and I think that this one is a video. So this was used in a legal case. This was an exhibit in a legal case. And I think that, I don't know if I have to press on the video or they have to press in order to get the video to work. Is that something that you can do, Craig? Or do I have to click? Don't click on the forward, or is it going to move? Okay, here it goes. So now you can see the video. This was a reconstruction done based on an autopsy report. The victim was a man. He was seated on this landing between two staircases. He was holding something in his hand that looked like a gun. Officers were called to the scene and staged, meaning that they set up, but they didn't announce themselves yet. Officer A was in the kitchen with a handgun, so he shoots individual rounds. Officer B was in the living area. He was holding a shotgun. A shotgun shoots multiple pellets. And so this kind of reconstruction can be used. It's actually scanned at the site. You can use it in order to be able to see what the officer may have viewed. And this is the autopsy report with the trajectories through the body. And this is what the trajectories would have looked like at the scene, with the yellow indicating the shots from the shotgun and the red, the shots from the handgun. And an exhibit like this can be used in court to explain to a jury what an officer could have seen or couldn't have seen and what the position of the victim was at the time that he was shot.
Which is very hard for a jury to imagine based on the anatomic position that you saw. But so this is a way of taking the data and communicating it to the people who have to make the decision about what really happened there.
And a lot of times the questions that come up in court are things like, did the officers claim that he had his hands up towards them, and yet there were gunshot wounds that were going up the forearms. So was it compatible with what their testimony is, or is it different from what they're saying? And that can be helpful.
In that particular case, what kind of gun was that guy holding?
Yeah, so it turned out in that particular case, the one that I was consulted on, he wasn't actually holding a gun. He was holding the nozzle from a hose, and he was just playing with it. But the neighbors thought it was a gun, and the officers ended up shooting him. And the police department was actually considered liable in that case.
He was pretty drunk, too.
Yeah, he was drunk as well. For the civil case. So I don't think they ever even announced that they were there. So for those of you who like crime fiction, and we write crime fiction as well, so the things that we read and we find that often crime fiction gets wrong, both in literature as well as on television is a disregard for chain of custody. They often, will have the police take the evidence and bring it to their buddy. And that's not what really happens. You need to be able to maintain chain of custody. You have to have certified or licensed experts who are accepted by the courts to be able to give an opinion. You can't just leave it with that person. They need to sign it out, and it has to stay within chain of custody.
You have to imagine that everything you're going to do is going to go to court someday.
That's right.
In fact, that's one of the stressful things about Judy's profession compared to others in medicine is everything she writes down is going to be picked over by lawyers, right?
And then, on television, you have people getting shot and, jumping in all sorts of different directions as if the bullet has forced their body to propel backwards. Bullets don't do that. They're too small. So they can cause someone to immediately crumple and collapse if it hits their head or their spinal cord. But otherwise, if it just hits arms and legs, the person's momentum will continue them moving forward. A lot of times people don't even know they've been shot. On television, they tend to have the time of death down to the half hour, which is really not going to be reliable based on scientific means. It's the scene and circumstances. And then on television, they also have police officers fighting over cases as if like everybody wants more work, which is not the case. If somebody comes and tries to take a case away from me, I'm like, be my guest. I'm more than happy to hand it off to you. This idea of people fighting over work is absurd to me, and it shows up on television all the time. And then I also mentioned the superhero protagonist, the forensic pathologist who knows everything. And then also they tend to confuse coroners and medical examiners and forensic pathologists. We all have different roles and the jurisdictions differ, so it is important to get that kind of research correct. So we wrote our first book, Working Stiff, was nonfiction. It was a memoir. It was based on my training at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, primarily written to encourage students and educate the public about real forensic work. And then we've also subsequently written some novels where we tried, this is an example of the trajectory analysis we did for First Cut.
Yeah, we actually, Judy made me this body diagram for one of our fictional dead bodies because we wanted to make sure that we got it right, what happened to him.
Yeah, and I was counting the gunshot wounds down to the final edit.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also are science communicators. We love talking about science and teaching people about forensic science. So, we're both active on social media, primarily on Twitter. We have a blog, and then I author a regular column on MedPage Today. If you're interested, you can sign up for that, and you can give them your email, but there's no cost. It's not behind a paywall.
And you can use a disposable email, whatever you want.
We don't encourage that, but
sure, why not?
but you don't have to pay for it. It's not behind a paywall, and we do write that together, even though it's under my byline. Everything I write, TJ.
And that's a monthly science column.
That's right, to make sure that it's understandable. And this is where I was working before we came to New Zealand at the Alameda County Sheriff Coroner's Office.
Alameda County is in the east side of San Francisco Bay, just over the water from San Francisco. It's where Oakland and Berkeley are, among other cities. 1.6 million people, I guess. Right?
Yeah, it includes Oakland and Berkeley in terms of the biggest population cities. So I was doing a lot of cases, and it was when the pandemic had started, and I knew that there was community spread of COVID-19. So I was starting to get concerned about myself, about my own colleagues, and about the staff at the office. And I wanted them to institute some major changes in terms of masking, social distancing, making sure that we could all stay safe. And I did not feel like I was being heeded or listened to. And subsequently, when I got offered a position in New Zealand, you can click to the next one. We ended up taking that offer and coming here to work in Wellington because I was really impressed with the way both New Zealand and Australia actually had handled the pandemic compared to the United States. And I think the numbers of deaths bear that out. While we were in managed isolation, one of my colleagues at the Alameda County Sheriff Coroner's Office, a tech that I worked with, passed away from COVID. We were grateful to be here. We've been here for over a year now.
Still are grateful to be here.
And still are incredibly grateful about the response. And just the fact that I feel like scientists are listened to here, it's really refreshing to have the feeling that the government and my agency has my back, so to speak. So if you're interested in forensic pathology in general or have more information, I know we can stay to answer questions as well. But we have our websites. For our writing, it's drworkingstiff.com. For my medical and legal consulting, it's pathologyexpert.com. And then we're also on Facebook and Twitter if you want to engage with us socially. And I encourage you to look up the books too. So are there any questions?
Oh, yes, there are questions. Thank you. That was an amazing talk. And just one of our commenters said that this is competency porn.
That's great. I love that. Oh, I got to quote that.
Okay, so let's go through some questions. So from Tim Menden, he says, have you been told that the final cause of death, except in accidents, is normally pneumonia? Is that correct? Sorry, he says he has been told that that's the final cause of death.
So that is not going to be the ultimate cause of death, or what we call it. It might be the most immediate cause of death, but it's not the proximal cause of death. So a person can have pneumonia, but pneumonia has to be due to something, because healthy people don't spontaneously get pneumonia. They do, but it's really rare. Usually it's pneumonia. The majority of pneumonias are bronchopneumonias, and they tend to be in people who are debilitated either from one disease or another. So it'll be bronchopneumonia due to complications of Alzheimer's disease, or bronchopneumonia due to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease from smoking. So pneumonia might be the more immediate cause, but it's the proximate cause, the underlying reason they got the pneumonia, that's going to be the real cause of death. Pneumonia can't stand alone in most cases.
Okay, Madeline R. asks, if you work directly with death and think about it so much, do you live being acutely aware of our fragility? Does that alter the risks that you take and the decisions you make?
Oh, you should read it. You'll find it. Yeah. So I'm a very sunny, happy person. And so when you meet me, which you just have, I mean, seeing me talk, I'm really like glass half full kind of gal.
I'm a guileless, sunny optimist, in fact. I started training in death investigation, TJ, that would be me, worried that my new job would change the way I looked at the world. And that's true. I was worried about that. But Judy knows what's going to kill you.
Yeah.
And what isn't.
And the majority of things that are going to kill you are pretty common sense, like wear your seatbelt, don't drink too much, look both ways before you cross the street. So dealing with death on a daily basis makes me appreciate the fact, first of all, that you can avoid most deaths just with common sense. And then the stuff that's totally random that you can't avoid, why worry about it? It's totally random. So it definitely actually gave me a much more positive outlook on life. And I gotta say, just like most people who work with death on a daily basis, it's not just me in forensics. It's also people who work in hospice care, people who work in the funerary industry. We are all, because every single day we have a reminder of how fragile life is, we really appreciate every single moment we have on this earth.
I found that nearly every unexpected fatality I investigated was either the result of something dangerously mundane or of something predictably hazardous. And that pretty much says it.
Yeah, so that's those are the opening chapter. That's in the opening chapter of Working Stiff. So I do encourage you to read it, because I do think it's one of the positive things we've heard about the book is that it's very life affirming.
Yeah, about death.
Yeah, and that's just who we are.
Right, okay, so this COVID thing. So Tanga Takaro asks, how do you determine death by COVID and death by vaccine? And I guess related, can you comment on the claim often made by anti-vaxxers that people are dying with COVID, not of COVID? They are claiming that COVID is not dangerous this way.
So first of all, let's before we even tackle this, I want to tackle a myth that has to do with the fact that COVID deaths are somehow being overcounted, or that COVID is put on death certificates and therefore people are dying.
That's what's implied
with COVID
in that second
as opposed
question.
to not of it. The thing is that when we write a death certificate, let's go just back to that cause of death, right? We have we can write a death certificate, and we have different parts of the death certificate. The first part of the death certificate is the cause of death, and that's the disease or injury that started the lethal sequence of events. But then there's another part of the death certificate that actually is called other significant conditions. And other significant conditions is where we put people's underlying medical diseases that make them more prone to dying. Okay, from that condition. So for instance, let me give you an example of when we don't use other significant conditions. If a person is crossing the street and they get hit by a car, okay.
Doesn't matter what their diabetes was.
I don't care about their diabetes, exactly. I don't care about their heart disease. They would be equally dead from that collision and from the blunt trauma if it weren't for that car hitting them, and their diabetes and heart disease would not be under other significant conditions. If, however, the car didn't run them down and it just was, knocked them over, and then they got to the hospital and they had a broken rib, and then they developed pneumonia, and then they got to the nursing home and they couldn't get up and they couldn't get better because they also have heart disease and they also have diabetes, and they got sicker and sicker and sicker until they died. The cause of death would still be a result of the motor vehicle collision, but we would then acknowledge the other significant conditions contributing to the death that made them more prone to die from an otherwise minor injury.
Sure.
Okay.
So what does that have to do with COVID then?
So the reason this has to do with COVID is because in investigating COVID deaths, and we realized pretty quickly that the people who were more susceptible were people who were elderly and had other significant conditions, underlying disease, comorbidities. They would not have died at that moment were it not but for getting COVID.
Right.
But by acknowledging those other diseases on the death certificates, that's how epidemiologists realized who was at risk. So we need to put those other diseases on the death certificate, but that doesn't mean they died with COVID, not of COVID. They did die of COVID. It's just those other conditions made them more susceptible and more likely to die. And there are some people, for example, who might have gotten murdered and had COVID. We would not then put COVID on the death certificate. We would acknowledge it in our autopsy report. They would still get counted as a COVID case for WHO criteria to figure out how many cases, but they wouldn't count as a COVID death. Okay, so the counting is very specific and very careful. And both medical examiners and coroners and agencies throughout, public health agencies around the world, have been very careful at counting the numbers. And in general, if we look overall at the numbers throughout the world, we've actually been undercounting COVID, not overcounting it. When you look at excess deaths compared to previous years, how many people die every year at certain parts of the year, and you compare it to previous months and previous years, we've undercounted COVID significantly, not just worldwide, but in the United States.
Especially in the United States, we believe that a lot of nursing homes, aged care homes, were
they weren't testing
writing people off as having died of old age or whatever their old age disease was. When in fact they might have been COVID positive.
So in the early parts of the pandemic, we didn't have sufficient testing. And that was one of the reasons they were undercounted. And then furthermore, as the pandemic progressed, there are a lot of places that don't necessarily test everybody, so they're not going to necessarily pick them up. And then you've got the people who died, not because of COVID directly, but because of COVID indirectly, meaning that they're the heart attacks who should have gotten medical care.
And this was happening in the United States. It happened in Italy. It happened in the UK.
Yeah, or the motor vehicle accidents that would have survived with medical care, but the hospitals were overloaded. And the ambulance got rerouted and didn't get to them in time. So those were excess deaths as well.
The suicide rate, however, has not gone up.
No, not appreciably.
Right. Which is another thing that you hear people say is, people are stuck at home and it's causing more damage than COVID would. That's not true.
So there have been more calls to mental health lines, especially here in New Zealand, but the suicide rate actually went down during the lockdowns, which was very interesting. And I think, my perception is probably because families were together and were giving each other.
As did the regular influenza rate and things like that, because we weren't interacting with each other and swapping germs like we usually do.
Okay. I'm assuming you guys don't have to rush away because I've been given permission to keep asking you questions because you're so fascinating.
So try to be brief in our response.
Yeah, sorry.
Right. Okay, so just coming back to that last question, though, somebody was asking, how would you determine that somebody had died because of the vaccine that they received?
Yeah, so there's actually autopsy protocols associated with vaccine, suspicious deaths. So what we do is on all of our cases that come in, that because we've gone through a large, vaccine rollout here in New Zealand over the past few months, we're documenting, and the police have been documenting in every single sudden death or unexpected death when they last got their vaccine. So both the first jab as well as the second. And so then based on whether they had any kind of symptomatology. So we want to see whether, and the proximal, like if the vaccine was 3 months ago or 4 months ago, the likelihood that it's vaccine related is incredibly low, as opposed to if the vaccine was just a day or two ago, in which case we would then ask questions. We ask questions about symptoms. We ask questions about underlying disease. We go through their medical records and we decide whether or not an autopsy is warranted, because, you know, there are a lot of people who are elderly and expected to die, and they just coincidentally got their vaccine temporally related to when they died. That doesn't mean that it's a vaccine related death. And so then in cases where we do perform an autopsy, we can take blood and serum and check for allergens or allergic reactions. And we also, I make incisions, or I cut down on the area where the vaccine was and look for any signs of bleeding or infection. And then we look to figure out if we can understand what the underlying cause of death is. If we can find, for example, that a person had a dissecting aortic aneurysm, that's not linked to any vaccine-related complication. That's linked to high blood pressure and atherosclerosis. So if they have underlying disease that can explain the death, and the findings are not associated with any vaccine complication, then we can rule it in.
Well, how about the opposite? How about myocarditis in a
right.
young male who has no risk factors?
So that's the other thing, is if we, let's say we're hypothetically to get myocarditis, I've yet to get a case like that here that's vaccine related. I have gotten some cases of myocarditis that are just background, that people who didn't get the vaccine and then got myocarditis. You can send the muscle out to look to see if COVID-19 virus is in there, or other viruses are in the
right.
tissue. So that way you can attribute the myocarditis to a particular virus.
Right,
or
the vaccine, though.
So for the vaccine, usually it's considered an autoimmune phenomenon, and then we would just presume that it is based on the temporal relationship. Okay. But that's the hard part, is sometimes you don't know. So sometimes you might just say myocarditis, and then you'd acknowledge recent COVID-19 vaccine, and then we would look to see overall, statistically, epidemiologically, are we getting more of these, or is this just background?
Right. Okay. So a couple of out of the ordinary questions here. Ian Bryce asks, have you ever come across spontaneous human combustion?
I have not come across spontaneous human combustion. The literature basically suggests that what happens in these cases that appear to be spontaneous is that usually it's obese individuals or people with a lot of fat and clothing, and then the clothing lights on fire, and then there's kind of a candle wick effect where the fat itself becomes a source for combustion. But usually in the majority of cases, when they're investigated thoroughly, it tends to be not spontaneous. It tends to be that there is some sort of incendiary source, like a cigarette.
Okay.
Cigarettes? Cigarettes are good.
Yeah.
Spontaneous combustion?
So Madeline R. asks, knowing so much about death, how do you feel about organ donation or donating your body to science?
Oh, I think it's incredibly important. There are so many. I actually worked, so full disclosure, I worked for close to 4 or 5 years with the liver transplant team at UCLA when I was a medical student. And there are so many people who are waiting for organs and are on organ transplant lists, who need kidneys, who need livers, who need lungs and hearts, especially children. So it's so important to be an organ donor or to donate your loved one's organs if they're in a position to donate, just because it really will. This is one way we can really save lives, if we could donate more organs. So I'm a big advocate for organ and tissue donation. I think it's incredibly important and incredibly helpful.
And for Judy's own post-mortem plans, I know this because I'm her husband. She wants
first
me.
I want to be a donor if I can.
Right, be a donor for everything that you can be, and then she wants me to find someone with flesh-eating beetles, flesh off of her bones, so that they can be rearticulated
as a skeleton
and stood up at UCLA or donated to UCLA
or Otago now.
Or Otago,
right.
Otago. But since she'll be dead already, I can do whatever I want with them, and I suspect that I might just put them at the top of the stairs to scare children. Because real human skeletons now are rare, and that's what she wants to.
So I think it would make for a very nice teaching specimen, and that way I could be in a lecture hall listening to science
forever.
Very good. Okay, one final question. So, excluding your own fictional works, are there any fictional representations of forensic pathology not psychology, that are accurate?
Fictional. Ooh.
There are. I can't think of any offhand.
So we're thinking kind of CSI kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I mean, I
yeah.
think the best, and the two writers who are best known for their forensic work are Patricia Cornwell, who actually worked as a transcriptionist at the Virginia Medical Examiner's Office for many years, and then Kathy Reichs, who writes from the perspective of a forensic anthropologist, and both of them are scientifically accurate. From television shows, no, I haven't been.
Not a lot.
I mean, I'm consistently disappointed by them. So hopefully one day somebody will reach out to me and say, "Oh, let's do a TV show."
It's part of the reason why, after having written Working Stiff, which is nonfiction, it's a memoir, although it's written in the first person, so it's narrative nonfiction. It reads like a novel. We switched to fiction because we really wanted to write detective fiction where the science was real and the police work is real, and let our imaginations run wild with the crazy things that our character might do. But the science in our books is as real as we can make it. And it's a lot of fun to be constrained that way.
Very good. Okay, we will leave it there. You have been a fantastic pair of presenters and absolutely fascinating. And thank you very much for coming and joining us at the convention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.